Well, hello, everyone. I don't know how many are out here with this time change here going on in the Motor City, but nonetheless, they can always catch the replay. Here we are in our 33rd installment of What is Truth? For those of you that don't know, that was a question put forward by Pontius Pilate himself. And that's an interesting subject that we'll explore in one of our episodes. In this episode, we're kind of looking at the fabric of thought. And we've been exploring certain writers and all the various cross pollinations that occur within the realm of the arts. And being is that the Honorable Reverend David here and I both wholeheartedly agree that the arts occupy a higher position than philosophy. And my inclination in that regard is that it provides an open ended avenue for the exploration of the presence of spiritual content within the world. And perhaps David agrees. I'm not sure, but that's part of the reason why we're here. We're trying to explore where we might agree and where we might disagree. But that being said, uh, it it somehow always seems to get down to the concepts that are enfolded in language, and that's something that's been very much an avenue of approach in philosophy. Is that what is the meaning of meaning? What do words mean? And one of my favorite explorers in that regard is the late Owen Barfield, who was a member of the Inklings. They used to meet in a pub near Oxford University, a group of university dons, and Owen Barfield was a barrister who was an editor for Faber and Faber Publishing Company, which is interesting. And he was also a translator of many lectures of Dr. Rudolf Steiner and was quite a significant author. And it's interesting when you look into Owen Barfield because there's a whole constellation of scholars that concern themselves with the works of Owen Barfield, and they're oblivious to his connection to Dr. Rudolf Steiner and spiritual science, because Owen Barfield, as is the case with anthroposophists in general, don't proselytize. It's not a missionary zeal that they carry. It's merely because spiritual science or anthroposophy is not a religion, but it's a tool that, or a whole box of tools, you might say, to give you another way of looking at this world in which we live and what it means to be a human being. For anthroposophy itself, it, basically, anthropos, human, Sophia, wisdom. So the wisdom of being human. And so this can bring further depth to anybody. And Rudolf Steiner makes a very specific point very early on in his lecturing career of over 6,000 lectures that it has to do with a deepening, and that has something to contribute to all the religions of the world. That it's not a religion, although it deals with the subject of religion and draws its inspiration out of the what is called the Grail stream in the West, and the later successor to the Grail stream, the Rosicrucian stream, the true Rosicrucian stream, which is not a club. There's no membership cards, there's no dues. If you are deemed worthy of being brought into deeper relationship to these remarkable individuals, don't worry, they'll find you. But in that regard, in light of initiation knowledge, which is essentially what we talk about in one form or another, which has to do with supersensible knowledge of the being and destiny of mankind. And that can contribute something of value to anybody of any persuasion, even a scientific materialist, were he to spend the time to attempt to actually understand what Rudolf Steiner thought he was trying to say, rather than the abstract impressions that echo in the heads of those that are dealing in the realm of abstract thinking that's encased in the materialistic worldview. And so that's where we get on this is how individuals within the historical stream of the arts have dealt with the transitions that mankind has gone through in the evolution of consciousness that's so succinctly laid out in the works of Rudolf Steiner. And is also hinted at or addressed in many of the scriptures of the world. And so if you want to look at it from a scientific view of traditional science, so to speak, which tends towards the Darwin theory of evolution, and then you have the traditional creationist view that's biblical, and Rudolf Steiner's view of that is unique in that it incorporates both those views into a higher understanding based upon his capacities of clairvoyance that enable him to perceive into the worlds of soul and spirit and use his scientifically trained thinking principle. He is able to express to us in a way that's never been revealed before to mankind, because at earlier stages of our evolution, we didn't have the necessary concepts or understandings to be able to convey it in that fashion. But nonetheless, it has been conveyed throughout human history by the great leaders of mankind and in our myths and fairy tales and legends. And so that's part of the challenge, is that it's a series of riddles that have been planted throughout history that people in their own path of self-discovery can unfold deeper meanings. And in keeping with the spirit of Rudolf Steiner's work, that's in a sense of Michaelic freedom, in that we are in the age of Michael beginning in 1879, a date I frequently make reference to, where we made the transition from the age of the Archangel Gabriel, which was so much tied in with secrets and also with ties of blood and secret associations and all of these various modalities of human endeavor. And so just to give that little précis, so to speak, of what we've been exploring the last few weeks, I'd like to now wholeheartedly bring to you from the city of London in merry old England, Reverend David William Parry. How are you there, David?
Afternoon, John. Dealing with the time change. It hasn't happened in Britain yet, so we haven't changed the solar time yet. Sorry. I'm well. Always a pleasure to see you. Dobry den and salam alaikum. I've got to say hi to my brothers and sisters across the Russian Federation and Central Asia, some of which are trying to join us. and particularly the Russian Literature Society on Facebook. Yes, we'll be talking about Russian novels today. I'll get them in somehow. And Joseph Ducroix, forgive me for not saying that, Joseph, I don't know how to pronounce your surname, who wants me to mention the ubiquitous John Waters, no, not the filmmaker, who I have immense trouble with Divine. I'm sorry, love, at that weight, you're not that divine. You know, a great star. Apparently, I haven't had the chance to look at the link. Apparently, that's Sinead O'Connor's The Baldy Woman that used to win all those awards years back. Apparently, he's her father, and he's been saying things about pro-life in America, and apparently the American left will spit in your face if you even dare to mention his name. So I was dared to mention his name, and there I did. John Waters, John Waters, John Waters, John Waters, John Waters. I'll try and follow up the hoo-ha at some point, but I think we've got enough trouble in Britain at the minute. There was a terrible murder a couple of days ago by a policeman, a serving policeman. If you want to know the time, don't ask a policeman, because God alone knows what they're up to. Nowadays, community policing was abandoned years ago in this country. Who on earth do they think they're serving exactly? We pay their wages. But yeah, a young lady actually in the area of London I used to live in. A young lady was murdered in Clapham, on Clapham Common or around Clapham Common, minding her own business and trying to go about her affairs relatively late in the evening, but not too late as far as I understand the story, to be murdered by a serving officer. So how is London at the minute? A bit darker than it was the week before, but you know, everything keeps going on here. Oh, initiation. I always agree with you when you say that consciousness is tied to initiation. You know, the expanse of our consciousness, our fields of consciousness, is somehow tied in with it. I agree with that 100%. I also think that there are certain rites, rituals, ceremonies that help expand that help expand our consciousness. Although I don't know, I'm beginning to think the supernatural. Yes, I do believe in a supernatural. Various realms and our interaction with those other kingdoms. I don't know, maybe rituals are spontaneous and act magically simply because they're designed by angels and they're controlled by spirits, as opposed to formalized enactments by human beings who come together at a particular time and place to force the issue. I'm not saying that never happens. I'm quite convinced it does. But I think that tends to be much more of a rarity than these people would like to admit. Yeah, I mean, the real Rosicrucians, I mean, dynamos of energy and evolution. I don't know. I suppose I get, this is where I find myself contradicting, not myself, but sort of certain outlooks that I spend a lot of my time attacking. What was Charles Darwin at the end of the day? A British scholar, sir, a British scholar. You know, and you know, people get him wrong. He was a Unitarian. The whole family were Unitarians. I mean, one of his uncles used to read Origin of Species from the pulpit as an insight into nature. You know, I get really sick of Darwin being dragged into this atheist, unbelieving camp when that certainly doesn't appear to have been the case. You know, yes, he didn't go to Church of England, Anglican Church, with his wife on a Sunday because he was a Unitarian. There we are. It doesn't mean he's thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Yeah, no, I mean, I found myself weirdly the other day defending Richard Dawkins, who, of course, I loosely know. You know, so yeah, I mean, I don't know. I find all this reductionism very. It's a fashion, rather like certain trans trends. That will get me into trouble. It's a fashion. It's a fashion. I have moved in LGBT circles since moving to London, which is the 80s. Now, in all of that time, I have met two, I'm holding the fingers up, two genuinely trans people. You know, and I've moved actively in those circles for a number of reasons, ministerial included, as part of my ministry. So, you know, I find all this hoo-ha in America bewildering. I'm tempted to hold back, but I don't think I'll be able to since I've raised the point. My worry about trans people is they tend to lead such unhappy lives. You know, these gentle, rare, incredibly rare people, are they ever going to meet a partner? I mean, let's face it, it's highly unlikely. The stats are against it. Human experience is against it. I mean, how many people are there? As opposed to this obnoxious fashion where everybody's, I mean, this is forefront, it's cutting edge. No, it's not. You know, there's nothing that's happening now that wasn't happening in the molly houses in Britain in the 1800s. There's nothing happening now that wasn't happening in the past. You know, and I don't know, I just find that very much of a worry. What is the link with initiation? Certainly there are alchemical links to androgynous initiatic rites. We've got to remember hermaphrodite tends to mean that which is beneath. It hasn't sexually differentiated. It can mean different things. Whereas androgyny traditionally tends to mean that which unifies above. Therefore, I think, yeah, what is it to me at the moment? What's happening apart from an explosive fashion confusing everybody? I mean, it's clear to see how it began. I promise I'll hand the com back to you in a minute, John. You know, I when I was doing my master's essays many years ago, it was Professor Bernard Hoos, who was my tutor, who said, "You've got to do something on genetics." And I said, "You know, Bernard, what do I know about genetics? For God's sake!" And he kept on, "You got to do it. You got to do it. You got to do it." And the minute I started looking at it, I suddenly worked out why he said it. The Human Genome Project and all of this gender stuff started when they uncovered the fact that a male and a female body didn't necessarily have a brain of the same gender, because there could be male brains and female brains not in the same male or female body. That's what started all of this. And then people like the University of Minnesota, with my deep respects to every other American university, decided that was a good bandwagon to jump on. It might be good for getting the money and a few extra students through the doors. And then they started declaring that how many genders are there now? I've lost count. You know, I mean, like LGBT. I mean, how many letters are there now? And do I know them all? You know, I mean, it seems to increase every week. So there is something real behind all of that. But of course, then bored students who will do anything to avoid reading a book or writing an essay decided to make it an issue. And now we have these bewildering scenarios across the Western world of people claiming to be this, that, and the other on very little pretext at all. Why does that irritate me? Which it does. As an openly gay man, for two reasons. Milo, what's his name? Yiannopoulos, what's his name? What an awful man. What an awful man. One minute he's gay because it suits his publicity drive. Now he's not gay because he's running out of publicity initiatives. He doesn't care about who he hurts or the way he hurts them. I am really unhappy with that grossly unpleasant individual. Because people, you know, the two trans people I know might get hurt by all of this. That's not acceptable because they've got difficult enough lives as it is. And how does it link in with initiation? At this rate, we'll never know, because the whole situation is becoming so ridiculous. Nobody can work out what anybody means by anything. But I know John and I believe in the light of wisdom and the saving grace of art. So I'm sure something can be worked out for truth, justice, and the Anglo-American way on this show. I'll hand it back to you, John.
Well, as always on this show, we tend to go off into various twists and turns, so I never know what I have to prepare to face here. It's like life. Life is what happens when your plans don't work out, someone once said. And I think that they were probably in advanced age when they came up with that, because that's not the kind of thing that you will find pursuing youth culture and being at today. What we find ourselves in is the glorification of youth culture in the world, and so there's not a great deal of depth. There's an attempt to go wide, and but it's in the shallow uh, end of the kiddie pool generally, and so it's devoid almost entirely of actual content. And a lot of people, if you ask them what they think, and then you try to get them to develop their ideas and what thinking might lay behind it, you come to the conclusion, oftentimes it's the case, that there really isn't any thinking going on at all, that they're just repeating something, you're talking to an echo chamber. And that's why, or not why, but that's one aspect of why Reverend David and myself tend to point to various authors that we don't agree with. And that is really important because, like sometimes I do receive some light criticism, shall we say, from anthroposophists that I might venture into subjects that are not uh, within the purview of what is considered to be anthroposophy, and I just have to laugh because anthroposophy is something that's meant to uh, have something to contribute to any avenue of life and any philosophical view, and wherever you might be coming from. And of course, the vantage point that Rudolf Steiner vouchsafes his opinions is, well, probably most succinctly the Gospel of St. John. And even if we bring it into even a finer focus, the first 14 verses in the Gospel of John give you a summation of what we're looking at when we attempt to broach the subject of what is truth. And Jesus Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he wasn't speaking in metaphors. That's the basic view of spiritual science in a nutshell. That's probably the most succinct expression that you could give, at least with my limited capacities, especially today coming in earlier with this daylight savings time, which is just another canard they come up with. But that being said, what is thinking, and how does it come about? And going back to a reference I made to Owen Barfield, who is such a fascinating writer. You can look at any one of his works and find that there's something there that's profound. And what adds profundity to Barfield, those that are familiar with him are aware that he had come across through his own studies the idea of the evolution of consciousness on his own, and then encountered the work of Rudolf Steiner. And that was the eureka moment for him. And of course, T.S. Eliot, who was a friend of Owen Barfield's, like I shared last week, the radio broadcasted T.S. Eliot, the famous poet laureate and winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, who was edited by the unscrutable or inscrutable Ezra Pound, who we covered quite thoroughly last week, and so there's really no need to get into that too much, because really what we're trying to get behind is the idea of fancy and imagination, and what are these faculties that artists and artisans, what are they relating to when they create a work of art, a work of semblance? A semblance of what? That's the real question. What are they getting at? What are they trying to accomplish with their art, other than just being mere representation? I mean, we can go back to The Merchant of Venice with William Shakespeare, and he says, "Tell me, where is fancy bred? Or in the heart or in the head? How begot, how nourished? Reply, reply. It is engendered in the eyes, with gazing fed and fancy dies, in the cradle where it lies. Let us all ring fancy's knell. I'll begin it. Ding dong bell, ding dong bell." And so you see that this is not a new question. This is something that has a great deal of depth. If you get into some of the more profound writers, like, for example, we could go to Schlegel, that Owen Barfield so effectively points out, who's considered to be the primary source water of the Romantic movement in literature and the arts and all of that, and the British Romantics developed out of that. And you also have your composers in the Romantic movement, such as Beethoven, Mozart, and so on and so forth, Chopin. And there's something going on there, and when you get into what Rudolf Steiner said regarding Oswald Spengler, of all people, and I think he's really more important today, specifically in the last 4 years, than he has been in the previous 100 years, and or close to 100 years. But in Oswald Spengler, he had a view of the evolution of civilization, but although he was like extremely educated, I mean, this is a gentleman that was versed in so many aspects of science and literature and all of that, that he's difficult to read, and of which Reverend David can attest to that. And he's looking at a view of the evolution of cultures, and came out with his magnum opus, The Decline of the West. And I want to get into that, but not today too much, other than saying that if you're looking for the source waters of globalist characters like Klaus Schwab and his Shaping the Future of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is what we're going through right now, is this attempt by the cartels to gain the upper hand in world culture through various secret associations and so on, that lead back into the 1800s. The 19th century is the source waters of a lot of this. And I had made mention on many occasions of the defeat of the spirits of darkness, the fall of the spirits of darkness in November of 1879. And now these spirits that thrive in materialism are now attempting to inhabit the minds and thought substance of human beings. And it'll be further down the road. We have a long way to go before we actually, on this level, defeat these spirits, which can be called the spirits of mammon, which is the spirits of this materialism and pestilence and perversity and all these dark, shadowy human activities that are the end game of the kind of thinking that's divorced from the spiritual world, that only deals with the material realm. And materialism, you could say, well, how is that found within the human being? Well, if you take a human body and you have it die, and the astral and ego leave, and then after 3.5 days or so, the etheric body disassociates itself from the corpse. Then you have the corpse, and it decomposes back into nature. That the laws of the material realm are the laws that are active in that decaying corpse. And so ultimately what you have is modern science is in the main based upon observing the corpse. And so that they're trying to riddle out the secrets of the world with corpse thinking, which is of course insufficient. But it's understandable how this develops, and you get into some of the thinkers that express through literature, like Goethe and Schiller, who were able to encompass the world of the living spirit, and there's something heartwarming that ensues when one reads those authors, or if like Rudolf Steiner made the point that when one reads the Gospel of John, it's as if walking through a meadow. And so there's something nourishing to the heart. And that gives you this food for the soul. And that there was a transition that used to be, and you get into Rudolf Steiner's understanding of the development of consciousness. You see, the further back we go in human evolution, the more real the worlds beyond the physical become for mankind, and that they receive from them in imaginal pictures their perceptions of the spiritual world, that they hadn't yet developed the clear reasoned thinking to be able to treat that content the way it's been treated in the works of Rudolf Steiner, because the aspect of developed thinking is something that is effective on every realm. And that's the important thing to understand. And that's why it's so important to learn how to think. And the key work in that process, subsequent to his truth and knowledge, is the philosophy of freedom, or the philosophy of spiritual activity, as now the modern editions title it. And in the philosophy of freedom, Rudolf Steiner develops a manner of observing thinking, to where in thinking about what is actually occurring within the realm of thinking, that one establishes an intuitive relationship to the world. In essence, it's a guidebook on how to think like an angel. Yes? And so it's incorporating the spiritual world, but through the process of deductive and inductive thinking, he's able to take you to the logical end result of that thinking is a spiritual process. Okay, and this is a good book to give to your friend, the Richard Dawkins. You should give him a copy of the Philosophy of Freedom and challenge him to read it, because Uh, I've run across people who claim themselves to be atheists and yet find that work completely inscrutable because it leaves them with the ultimate conclusion that they have to acknowledge the reality of that thinking is capable of thinking about thinking, and so that there's something that dwells uh, beyond what's considered the normative arena for thinking. And, uh, and there's other deeper levels. I remember a conversation I was having with Timothy Leary about the Dr. Timothy Leary of Harvard University, who worked with Richard Alpert or Ram Dass and these experiments that were actually a branch of a CIA operation. But we've had long conversations because I took him to dinner in Greektown, and he came into the Mayflower bookshop I used to manage, and I had met him also earlier when I performed at a concert with him in the Grande Riviera here in Detroit back in the '60s. So there's like a developed conversation going between us, and we started talking about the role of brain functions as regards to consciousness. And then I said, well, let me tell you a story. And I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again because it makes an important point. When I was about 19 years old, I happened to be looking for a pencil, and I was living at my band house at the time, and I knew we had one. I just didn't know where it was, and I was looking all over. And finally, I sat down in frustration in a chair, and my consciousness popped out of my body, went all the way up to the ceiling, and I was looking down at the top of my head. And it was perfectly clear daylight, ordinary consciousness. I wasn't in an astral world. I was observing the physical world outside of my body. So I know what the top of my head looked like at the time. It no longer looks like that, but at the time. And I could see behind the chair I was sitting in, and there, lying on the floor with various dust bunnies and so forth, was the pencil that I was looking for. And I could read the name on it, Eversharp, the whole deal, with the eraser on the end. And so after about a half a minute to a minute or so of being up on the ceiling with a complete sense of wonder, I popped back into my body, and I got up and looked behind the chair, and there was the exact same pencil. And mind you, I had never looked behind that chair, and it was backed into a corner so that you had to get up on the chair and go behind it or pull the chair out. But there was that pencil. And so I was able to write down, I believe I was working on a song or something like that. I said, so tell me, uh, in your model of consciousness, with all this stuff having to do with neurological functions and all that, can you explain what happened to me using your model and its various criteria? And he looked at me, and he's a wonderfully honest individual, although I disagree with him on a great many things, and I'm not in any way endorsing his behavior, but like anybody else, I always try to give people latitude to be whoever they are and come from wherever they're coming from. So I said, is there any way in your model that you can explain that? And has it ever happened to you? And he said, no, no, that's never happened to me. And no, no, I can't really explain it. And so you see somebody taken to the ring pass knot, the bubble of their modality, and having to acknowledge that there's things outside of the equation they're working with, that there's a open set as Georg Cantor, the mathematician, would describe it, that there, or as getting into Wittgenstein, and the whole set theory that arose from a very happenstance diagram he put on a chalkboard during his famous Cambridge lecture series. And mind you, Wittgenstein himself was even suspicious of his own writings, and so that you have a certain level of honesty in people that pursue ideas that is completely foreign to the current modality of people wanting to defend their ideas, that you better agree with them or else. And that is definitely not what we're trying to do here. And I use the analogy, though, of the train station. In the United States, if you go to the train station, there's a sign that says, please stay back from the train tracks. But if you go to Germany and the train station, there's a big sign there that says verboten, forbidden. And so it gets, again, it keeps going back to the distinction between those two words, shall and must.
What's that modern word? John is trying to trigger me. I believe that's the modern word. Oh, bloody Germans. This is where the Brit in me comes out. The last time I was in Munich, or München, as of course I should say, there was this gigantic German. There was me, the desperate Brit, slightly late as usual. Paperwork falling all over the place, bags here and there. And he said to me in perfect English, I assume you're waiting for the next train. And I said, yes, I'm. Well, is it still on time? And yes, it's perfectly on time. It will arrive in exactly 1 minute, 30 seconds. Do you know it did? 1 minute, 30 seconds later, I hated him. But at least they're interesting, unlike you, Frenchie. Gosh, oh God, you said so much. I wish I'd have met Timothy Leary. Although I'd have given him a punch in the face personally. He held me back for a couple of years. Drop acid and drop out. I took all that very seriously. I didn't realize he was Professor Leary when I thought, oh my God, it's this spontaneous guru figure. Yeah, sorry, with the full artillery of the American Academy behind you. So that wasn't in this neck of the woods always as forthcoming as it was over there. So as Russian novels evolved me, I'm getting to them, don't worry. I'd say that Timothy Leary held me back. Fascinating individual. I'd love to have met Ram Dass. I'd love to have met Ram Dass. I wouldn't say friend in the sense of Dawkins. I mean, I've come across him a couple of times. If there was, am I friends with the Cambridge atheists? I am an honorary member, for some reason or other, of the Cambridge atheists. I'm not entirely certain why. I think it was to do with the fact I was so incredibly rude about the last missionary tour that Billy Graham made to Britain. And I was incredibly rude, and I don't take a word of it back. I'm sorry. That doesn't mean at the end of the day I disagree with Dr. Graham. It means we've got a different point of view about the same thing, which I felt the Cambridge atheists didn't really quite grasp. At the end of the day, I'm actually on his side, even though I'm vehemently against certain things he's doing and certain things he's saying. Like Luis Palau, I mean, one of the great Latin missionary preachers who passed away, was it a couple of days ago? As I said on Facebook, the end of an era, and it is. Yes, I'd have disagreed with him on a great deal. Yes, I'd have opposed him very loudly on certain things. But at the end of the day, he was a fine Christian and has gone to his reward and glory. I don't understand this modern world where you can't say boo to a goose. And if you raise your voice, you've got to be the bitter opponent of somebody, as opposed to someone you disagree with on maybe minor levels sometimes. I sort of like those types of romantics. I mean, you're reminding me of Gurdjieff. I mean, what was that book of his? Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. My copy went missing years ago. Excuse me, which I thought was a cheeky book. I thought it was a cheeky book. Greek Orthodox, of course, people have him down as this crazed mystic in a fez, which he was. But of course, he was actually Greek Orthodox and very proud of it, which people tend to forget. So he wasn't really trying to smuggle Islam into Europe, although, oh my God, that's a whole series of shows in itself. And you know, in that show, I'm trying to struggle with different things here because it was made into a presentation. It was made into something like a documentary. Sort of, I thought it was cheeky because it's looking at where thoughts come from. And I noticed the character of Beelzebub, who of course is on Mars, looking at us down his Tescuano, down his microscope. We're all little bugs compared to him. And he's looking at what we're doing because he can't work out why the archangels are so obsessed with us. So Beelzebub actually says at some point, you know, the origin of thinking isn't really for a civilization like ours. It belongs to different types of civilization, and it would basically have catastrophic effects if we started looking at the origin of thoughts and the emergence of consciousness. I can't help feeling he's actually right now that we've started to do those things in the West. You know, but cheeky. I mean, Beelzebub also travels around on an is it etheric starship? You see, that's cheeky. That means the book. That means the book itself cheeky. So I've always been in two minds about him, even though he's a very, very clever man. If I had a chum amongst the Cambridge atheists, it would probably be Raymond Tallis, who I think I upset. I haven't spoken to him for a couple of years. Who is a man you can have a conversation with because he's old school. I'm not sure you can really have a conversation with Richard. I mean, Richard, you know, someone described in the British press as a professional atheist, which I thought was one of the best descriptions I'd ever come across. I mean, yeah, look, you put yourself up for it, you know, and you always get the impression he's a bit like Torquemada. You know, are we all going to give in, or do we need torturing? You always get the impression that if he thought there was something to it all, he'd be totally and utterly freaked out and wouldn't be able to handle higher order truths. Whereas with Ray, I mean, you always got the impression, you got the feeling that sort of he's open to various new views, new slants on things. And I think you're looking at a very, very subtle deist in Ray, because he will have a question mark as opposed to a cross, so, you know, no further. At the end of a lot of his thinking and a lot of his books. Personally, I like the deists. I know a minister, of religion isn't meant to say that. You know, why? Because at least they believed in something, unlike most modern people. You know, this abstract God who orders and structures things, I think that's rather attractive. And certainly the origin of deism in Britain is from a series of moral giants. I mean, what they were trying to do was avoid the wars of religion on the continent. They were trying to reduce the idea of interreligious conflict. And they were looking at things from a rational, like Tolstoy. See, I got there. Like Tolstoy, they were looking... and they were looking at Christianity not mysterious, John Toland, from a very moral point of view. I mean, almost you could say an Islamic point of view. I mean, they reduced, I don't like that word, they reduced our good Lord to a moral teacher more often than not. But by the way, what's wrong with that? You know, a very, very wise man who witnessed to the moral law in the human heart. My heavens, I wish there were more people talking about our good Lord in that way these days, as opposed to the offensive nonsense they tend to come up with now. So I'm always very fond of deists, which gets me to Russian literature. I think I said it on this show before. Whereas Timothy Leary held me back for over a year, I mean, I didn't go out as an early teenager for 2 years from the parental homestead because I discovered Russian novels And they're the best 2 years I ever had. If you read Tolstoy, he gives you the world. You don't just have a novel there. You have the world, and the intricacies of Dostoevsky. There wasn't anything the man didn't see. I mean, The Idiot is a very. If you want to look at disbelief or question marks, look at something like The Idiot by Dostoevsky. The Prince, of course, releases himself from an asylum. I notice modern translations tend to say sanatorium. That's much more generous than the older translations. He releases himself from an asylum and goes around spreading goodness. So it's quite obvious who we're dealing with here. And of course, the dagger at the back of all of that is he just a lunatic? And is it just his own personal view as a lunatic? Those are much more challenging, and be challenged. Christians, be challenged. What we mustn't do is say we're a system of ideas, and too many Christians think we're only systems of ideas. All we've got are dogmas and doctrines. My heaven, then there's no future for any of the churches if that's true. Thank heavens it's not true, because we have people like Rudolf Steiner, amongst others, who will say no. There are whole areas of religious experience, interaction with higher levels of consciousness. No, there's a lot more than that. So certainly, if that's all we've got, and particularly oddly, because as a system of ideas, it refuses to engage in the marketplace of ideas nowadays. So it looks debased and valueless. It's a philosophy, but it won't defend itself in the philosophical arena. All of this is nonsense. And it shows at the end of the day that Christians, too many, have become afraid. Listen, either it's true or it's not. Kierkegaard, the end. There we are. If it's not, let's talk about something else. But what if it's true? How about that? I think we've got to be a lot less scared of ourselves and what we think and what we believe. And Kierkegaard's the perfect example. Of course, he was a Scandinavian, not a Russian. Without the Russians, I think, and Russian novelists, I wouldn't have been quite as aware of the spiritual struggle, which is exactly the same in their part of the world as it is ours. I wouldn't have become aware of the great bookshops, curiously. We mention Shakespeare and Company a great deal on this show at the minute, and God bless them, because they're struggling hard. We mentioned Watkins recently, which I think is closed at the moment. Word on the street has it it's considering not reopening. Watkins, please reopen. Watkins, please reopen. There are only 2 other bookshops in London I can think of like that. There's Atlantis Bookshop in Museum Street, which is, I've spoken there on a number of occasions. They very kindly launched my first collection of poetry, where I was stood wearing a laurel crown on the sort of raised platform, thinking I can bear, the lighting is so atmospheric I can barely see the text in front of me, and was frightened of missing my footing and landing on the carpet in front of me. But there's Atlantis, because they hold cultural events, they hold book launches, they try and engage with the audience. And the other one being Treadwell's, and all of these places. So there are 3 in London, all of which are directly under threat at the minute, which is monstrous. And the great Shakespeare and Co. in Paris. I don't know. I'm back to books again, John. It makes me think we need to treasure books. I was criticized. I promise I'll just say one more thing. I get a lot of flack from certain evangelicals. Listen, evangelicals, also some of my best friends are conservative evangelicals, so eat that. Yes, I've kept it quiet. Ha! So, but they are. I get accused of being a man of books. Yes, and thank heaven. And I think that's one of the reasons I connect with John Barnwell so much, because he's an interesting bibliophile in his own right, and it's an honor to know him. So, handing back to you, John.
Well, yeah. Bibliophilia. Yes, books. What are books? Isn't that what the little fawn said to Rock from Pindhorn? Rock was sitting in a library, and the little nature being Said, "What are those?" He said, "Those are books." He said, "What are books?" And he explained to him what they were. But that being said, I never got to meet Rock, although I knew a lot of his associates from Tinhorn. By the way, if you were wearing a laurel crown on your head, then it wouldn't be a platform, it would be a dais. So David expounding on a dais with a laurel crown, that I've got to see. I've never done anything of such a profound nature that myself. But that being said, let's get back. Where were we here? Well, yes, when you get into some of these things and you find that people are unwilling to entertain thoughts that are outside of this system that they've developed that thinks in them. And that's the important thing to understand is things think in you, that you, when you have a formal system of language, which could include mathematical language, by the way, that it will think in you. And of course, the purest form of language in many regards, uh, according to form, is mathematics. And so you have the mysteries of Pythagoras and the way in which one can understand this is that in the sevenfold scheme that I work with out of the work of Rudolf Steiner and Madame Blavatsky, C.G. Harrison, and others, the ancient cultures of the world, that I frequently represent the Hopi Indians that say that this is the fourth world. Although I might add the Navajo say it's the third, but that's because they're starting from a different point in the series. And in that regard, if you look at the Old Testament, that the events of Genesis are pointing towards the second period of Earth evolution, or the third period of Earth evolution, the Lemurian period. So in the middle of the Lemurian period, the events surrounding Adam and this Nephilim's type of storyline was developed. And so there's my content for the Nephilim conference. But although I won't be speaking about it, it'll be something that might confuse others. And so I don't want to get in the way of their theorizing. In that regard, if they want to explore what I just said, they can go back to the outline of occult science and take it from there. Great work by Rudolf Steiner. Getting back to some of this, you see that we have these thought structures that we inhabit, and we're some people that come to America from another country, and they speak English and they speak fluently and all of that, and I have a tendency to ask them, when you're like thinking in your head, do you think in English or do you think in like German or French? And I like to ask them, when you dream, are you dreaming in French? Or are you dreaming in English? What language is all of this occurring? Because that's, to me, fascinating to see how that shakes out. And of course, I get different answers from different people. And but nonetheless, if you look at some of the comments, for example, that Rudolf Steiner had made regarding Latin, and Latin is very much a fundamental language of science, and it's considered a dead language because it it's a finished language. It's a language of the fourth post-Atlantean period, the age of the intellectual soul, and so it has a very formal structure. And if you pursue philosophy in Latin, the philosophical conclusions that you derive from philosophizing in Latin will be determined by the laws of grammar. Just so you know that. I'm just giving you a little advance warning if you decide to pursue philosophy in Latin, that it's the rules of grammar that are going to bring you to the end game. And so you see, but this is the way it is with the world of language in particular. And getting back to Pythagoras and number, the old sun evolution, which is the second stage in the series of 7 worlds, of which planet Earth is the 4th, the human realm. But when you go 2 stages before we became humans, as we know them today, that it's the old sun evolution, and that's kind of the etheric evolution. The primal physical is old Saturn, which is merely a realm of warmth, and then there's old sun, which is the primal etheric, old moon, the primal astral, and then Earth, the ego, is brought to mankind in the Lemurian period. And this is something donated from the spiritual world. So see, this, while it works through the creationist theory, it doesn't work through it in the way in which your average creationist today works about it, because they would like you to think that before the Garden of Eden events and all that story, that there's just well, they have various ways of explaining it, but they don't go as far back in their cosmogenesis, as we would call it, according to the terminology of Blavatsky, that there's anthropogenesis, the genesis or origin of mankind, and then there's cosmogenesis, the origin of the cosmos. And the basic view that Schlegel, who I had mentioned earlier, was considered the father of Romanticism, it came about through his study of language and his encounter with a Brit who was at that time, mind you, all the British adventures, mercantile adventures around the world, brought them into contact with the Indian culture. And when they tried to set up a system of jurisprudence in India, they had to try and get behind, well, okay, well, what are these people, what's their views on law and justice? And so they had to go back to the law books of India to try and discern what that was, so that they understood what they thought about what was lawful. And so they encountered the laws of Manu, and which is very interesting, because when you get into that, and Sir Alexander Hamilton, who's of the Hamilton family, there's some kind of distant relations of mine, but that's being said, Sir Alexander Hamilton, through his interactions with Schlegel and this whole idea of the work that was being done, and I have to look here into my notes a little bit, where you get to understanding there's an individual, the names of Sir Charles Wilkins and Sir William James are probably the best remembered. Sir William Jones, a distinguished Oriental scholar, was appointed a judge of the Supreme Court of Calcutta. Okay, so that's what was happening in India at the time. And so you have published the first part of his Institutes of Hindu Law and the Ordinances of Manu. The first book of the Ordinances of Manu consists of an account of the creation of the world and contains the substance of what Rudolf Steiner, at much greater length and using a modern idiom, was later to disclose in his Occult Science and Outline. And I was quoting from Owen Barfield's article, Where is Fancy Bread? And that's a wonderful article. You can find that online. Bread is B-R-E-D, as in breeding. And but in there, he develops the understanding of the subtle distinction that can be found between uh, imagination and something that is just a fancy, and so that there's something that has a basis in a reality, another thing that's just, shall we say, more arbitrary. But in the text, he says, and I quote, "So the imagination is essentially vital. The images begotten by imagination are alive and creative and have a sort of germinating power of their own." I mean, you can live with that thought for a long time. That is definitely a riddle as only someone like Owen Barfield can bring to bear on the subject. And so when you start looking at these things and you say, well, what are the sources of inspiration of culture? And you look into the ancient rites and rituals and the church rituals that are mentioned by David that still had a tremendous power of influence in a certain way that started to diminish as man started to become more materialistic, because it was necessary for mankind to evolve to where they had an experience of themselves as separate from their community, from the family, just as a pure individual. And now it's time for us to awaken our relationship to the spiritual world anew without losing our individuality within our family, group, nation, what have you. And so you mustn't demonize these things in the wrong fashion, but see them as evolutionary modalities that are meant to bring about a certain result. And Rudolf Steiner gets into specific details that are very much tied into understanding this. For example, he talks about the influence that is had on the human consciousness and brain since the ancient Atlantean period. He talks how during the Atlantean period, the etheric body was not fully incorporated into the physical brain. And so it enabled us to live in what is much more closer to the world of dream that we now experience, some of us more than others, when we go to sleep. And he said that it was through the entry of iodine into the human diet that helped to bring about a consolidation in a harmonious way of the etheric body of memory. And it's that vehicle of life that we share with the plant kingdom. And that there has to be a certain cohesiveness between the physical body and the etheric body for a wholesome evolution of consciousness and function to be established. And he makes the example of handicapped individuals that are suffering the consequences of improper association between the etheric body and the physical body. So that some of these problems can be remedied. Many people are aware of the place of iodine or iodide in the proper function of the thyroid gland. Well, here in America, we have had a long-standing program of introducing fluoride into the water, okay? And that happens to be something that displaces iodine within the system. And it causes a dampening down of consciousness. So you'll see that, for example, like the psychological or psychiatric drug Prozac, for example, that's based in fluoride. Basically what they do is they make you docile by giving you large amounts of fluoride. And that was included in our water system. And to quote exactly Albert Einstein's brother, it makes you stupid. And that was at the end of a movie I saw back in the 60s. So I learned very early on. The movie was Sunseed, and tagged on the end, they had a little short episode of Albert Einstein's brother saying, "Don't take fluoride, it makes you stupid." And it was being put into the water system, and which was really a terrible thing to do. And actually, quite recently, over the last few years, the government organizations determined that maybe it's not such a good thing, that it's supposed to help prevent tooth decay, dental caries, and so that they reduce the amount of fluoride they put in the water by 50%. Well, thank you very much. Not. It needs to be eliminated entirely. And so I have a water system here that I filter my water, and I also take iodine. Alex has the best iodine that I found by far, but the etomidine that is mentioned by Edgar Casey, known as the Sleeping Prophet, is also good. Can be found on the internet, but also eating seaweed. For years, I marketed a product that was seaweed based, and I've been involved in, like in macrobiotic diet. I was very much into in the mid 70s, and a big part of macrobiotics is using seaweed, right? Sea vegetation, and the fluids in the body. We're more of a fluid than anything else on our physical body. And what, like some 80% or so of the human body is fluid, and it's pretty questionable, the understanding of what that means as far as the scientific observation of living organisms, because they're only beginning to get into where they can more closely look at what's actually going on within a physical body, given that we're essentially on one level kind of a hologram that's projected down here from the spiritual world. So it makes it difficult for a lot of the theoretical understandings to pan out. And I give the old story of the my friend who was a student, and I've told this many times, but it's significant. And that uh, he was one of the brainiacs in school, Tristan, and he was working. I asked him what he'd been doing. I ran into him in a 20-year reunion many, many years ago. What he'd been doing? He said he was working in government projects, and I said, "Oh, well, you're working on the holographic model of the universe." Then he said, "I can't talk to you," and he turned around and walked away. So he obviously that's what they're working on, because that's why he couldn't talk to me. So just so you know, that your higher level physicists, they're not telling you, but that's what they're working on too. And so that, which is a interesting caricature of the view of the material world, because if you go back to the laws of Manu and the ancient Indian scriptures, they talk about the world as Maya. The, the world is an illusion, that this world is the dream, that the real world is the spiritual world. And what we're experiencing down here is really the dream. And Rudolf Steiner acquiesces on that point. It's not that this isn't real, but our understanding of what is actually going on here is that's the rub. That's the difficulty. And so when you get into understanding the dialogue between evolution and creationism, you have to be able to have a very open mind to be able to see that there's, in the Goethean sense, this whole idea of metamorphosis, of something arising out of something different. Where you look at a seed, you can look at that seed and unless you were very, very clairvoyant, you would not necessarily know what the plant that was going to arise from that seed was going to look like. And so things arise out of things that are not necessarily logical in one's first apprehension of them. That that's the way morphology is. There's frequently inversions and reversals, and so it's not just this very mechanical stair-step reality that people that are in support of technocracy being the way to go is that they think they understand things that they have no idea. And so, for example, if you get into DNA structure and they talk and they refer to the areas that they don't comprehend, they call it junk DNA, at least some do. And I'd like to think that some of them are smarter than that, but that even if it's only there as far as the actual resonant capacity of DNA to be able to respond to dynamic fields. But I had conversations about DNA with Timothy Leary, and back then he was referring to releasing the functions of histones and being able to unfold future stages of evolution of consciousness. So he was very much into the whole idea of evolution of consciousness. But when I asked him about scriptures, he said, well, he read more science fiction, which is interesting, because again, to your repeated attempts to include Philip K. Dick into our conversation and the whole idea of the theme of Blade Runner, right? That it's based on a Philip K. Dick novel. What do something about the dreams of Electric Sheep or something. I can't remember the original title. But that being said, so you see that there was a process that was nurturing mankind, that was very much tied into the family and coming through the age of Gabriel and leading up into the Michaelic age, where gradually people weren't finding the same nourishment from some of the old contexts, the old rites and all of that. And that, you see, that's what Friedrich Nietzsche was struggling with. But you see in his Birth of Tragedy, where he develops the whole idea of the Dionysian soul and the Apollonian soul as being two particular types, which leads into Oswald Spengler, which I look forward to, by the way, getting into that episode. That's going to be a lot of fun. But that there was something that was nurturing mankind within the realm of feeling that warmed them. And so when you take the cold intellect and the warm heart, how do they relate to each other? And there was a repression of that warmth that occurred because of the shift of the modality of the type of thinking. And so basically what we are doing as we move into the future is reimagining the world in a way in which the heart can wholeheartedly participate in the concepts that we're dwelling in. But to be able to do that assumes or implies that one is actively participating in our relationship to the spiritual world. But yet you look at the history of the church, and it was actually their job, and they did it for whatever reason, but to bring about a fearful view of independent research into the spiritual world, so that they would deal with it and want to make people fearful of it, that they would only go to the church to find guidance from the spiritual world. And even going back to 869 AD, in the pronouncement of the church that the ecumenical council, that the man was a being of body and soul, but that he was not a being of spirit. He could just have certain spiritual qualities. And so by losing the threefold view of mankind, alienated mankind over time from their direct inspiration of the spiritual world that's to be found in so much of the early Christians. And the profundity, all you need to do is go and look at the commentaries on the Gospel of John by Alanus of Insulis, for example. It's just, again, that whole feeling as if one is walking through a meadow, that there's this wonderful, beatific vision of the warm embrace of karma, rather than this cold, calculating, harmonic grip on your thinking, and that shall, and must. Again, we go back to shall and must, and this harmonic materialism says you must do this, and the shall is coming forth from the inspiration of the heart. I shall do this because it's the right thing to do. And so that's that still small voice of St. John. That's that voice of conscience. And so I find it interesting that I can go for so long, and it's almost to the end, and it's a beautiful thing because I haven't even gotten around to the things I researched that I thought that I was going to talk about. And that's the beauty of having an unending conversation. And but that being said, I want to share with you at this point, just so you appreciate, if I can find it, I don't even know where it is. That's the thing, as I look at these books and I set them down. I don't know where, oh, here it is. I don't know how, David, but you ended up on the floor. And so we're here with the Reverend David William Parry from London, as you all know. And here is his Grammar of Witchcraft, which is a Shakespearean study. It's not a book of witchcraft. His inspired poetry, Caliban's Redemption, that's Shakespearean-esque poetry, and his masterwork, Mount Athos Inside Me, critically acclaimed. It's Essays on Religion, Emanuel Swedenborg and the Arts. And that's edited by Daniela Erendus, a very talented young fellow. And those books are available on Amazon. And I have my works that there's 2 volumes, the Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail, the Order of the Knights Templar, and the True Rosicrucian Order. Some 640 pages with great many diagrams, which are also included in my second volume, The Arcana of Light on the Path. And there's a whole series of diagrams that I'll show. Oh, there's my translation of the alchemical poem of the Comte de Saint-Germain. And there's all these various diagrams that will give you a storyboard, so to speak, to be able to expand in your own studies regarding many of the subjects that we cover here. My books are available on eBay directly from me. I see that they're going for hundreds of dollars over in some of the other websites because they act as if they're not available, but actually they're just fishing for libraries, because if a library gets a request, they don't even concern with the price, but expediency, and they'll end up buying a book for a tremendous amount of money if it's only the only copy available. It was requested, and they have all these funds that they get from the taxpayers, and so they spend it poorly, in a poor way, shall we say, just to make their job a little bit easier by 5 minutes. But it's funny that, but my books are available on eBay here in the U.S. Outside the U.S., you want to contact me directly, or even in the U.S., you can contact me directly through my academia link that's posted below here, and also on Facebook and on YouTube. And you can get the books directly from me. And David's books, of course, much easier to get. You can go to Amazon. But I'm finding that the links that now that I post them on YouTube and eBay don't work necessarily. But the link for academia still works. So you can access all those links through that academia link. And but that's enough of that for the moment. But also, if you want to buy us a cup of coffee, it's paypal.me/deep PARRY 777 for David, and paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And those links, if you just click on them below, they don't work either. So they're disabling those types of links because they don't want us prospering without them getting their little touch. And in any regard, geez, we've covered so much ground, and it's only introductory to what I was hoping to talk about. And that just leaves us biting at the bit to get to the next episode, because I find that we're near closing time here. And unfortunately, some of the people came on board. They came late because of the time change. And by the way, if I make funny faces, it's because I'm squinting trying to read the commentaries, and so it may make me look like an old curmudgeon, but that's really not the case. It's just that when I squint, it can tend to make me look more evil than I am. And but that being said, I think what we could do now is allow the Reverend David to share with us whatever further insights he might have, and lead us into prayer to consecrate this wonderful moment together. Your mute is on.
That's strange. I turned it off, then it came on again. Yeah, I mean, we'll save the majority for next week. Certainly, I am interested in getting Philip K. Dick on the show. I mean, I think sci-fi is a very misunderstood genre, and I can think of spiritual benefit that I've received through reading H.G. Wells, amongst others. No, I think it's unwise. Fantasy isn't just fantasy. I agree with you completely there. Fantasy and imagination are not the same thing at all. Although obviously they're related, but they're not the same thing at all. But if I look at the way that Jules Verne is using fantasy, and some of it isn't fantasy, I'm not sure what it is. Or again, back to the British author Michael Moorcock. No, I think other things are going on, and fantasy needs to be unpacked and explored a lot more on this show, particularly in its literary forms, because it takes to wing there. Yeah, it's a shame about the shift in times, because of course it came out as an hour earlier for me in Old Blighty, which means my English Sunday roast hasn't gone down as effectively as it should have done. So I've not been at my usual, because it's still gurgling on its way down to my tummy. Anyway, my friends, viewers, listeners, let's be aware in the week ahead, in the days ahead, of our common humanity, our common bonds, the need to give each other space, the ways to resist judging others, ways to resist the judgments that originate in picture thinking, that originate in the lack of empathy and the lack of sympathy. And maybe literature is one of the great treasures and solutions to that, because it allows us to stand for a couple of hours, a couple of days, in somebody else's position and walk in somebody else's shoes. Please, let's remember all the best things that make us human. And in that spirit, remember the most human of humans and the greatest God of gods, our Lord Jesus Christ, who came to redeem each one of us from the position we're already in, not the one he hopes us to get to. Amen.
Amen. Well, that was a good one. They always are, but I think there's something happening to you. David, I can't help but think that there's a quickening. And I feel the same. I think that this is food for my spirit. And even if people don't pay attention, I'm going to continue these conversations anyways. Even if people don't contribute, they rarely do. And or if they don't even buy my books, okay, that's fine too. I'm just going to keep moving along here. But if you really want to understand what we're talking about, I would recommend at least having a look at our published materials. And that being said, I want to thank everybody for showing up. And again, sorry for the confusion regarding the time change, but you can go watch it as it's rebroadcast on Facebook and YouTube and on Twitter. So that being said, I bid you adieu.